Malik Johnson was having a typical afternoon. The 16-year-old had just finished school and was walking home through his neighborhood, enjoying the music blasting through his earbuds. He lived in a quiet suburban area, a place where most people didn't think twice about who was walking down the street. Malik was used to the peaceful vibe of the neighborhood, where everyone knew each other, or at least recognized each other's faces. But today, things were different. As Malik walked past a row of houses, he noticed a squad car slowly drive by. He didn't think much of it at first, continuing to enjoy his music. Then, without warning, the car came to a sudden stop, and the two officers inside quickly got out. Malik pulled his earbuds out, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but the sight of the police officers made him nervous anyway. He had heard stories about situations like this, times when people like him, young black men, were stopped for no reason at all. "Hey you, stop right there," one of the officers called out. Malik turned to see a man in a dark blue uniform, his face stern and unapproachable. The other officer, a woman, was watching him closely, arms crossed. Malik felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he tried to stay calm. "What's going on, officer?" he asked politely. "Where are you headed?" the man demanded, his voice sharp and cold. Malik could hear the judgment in his tone, even though he hadn't done anything to deserve it. He answered honestly, "I'm just walking home from school." The woman officer stepped forward, her eyes scanning him up and down. "What's your name?" she asked, though there was no reason for her to ask. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Malik hesitated for a moment, but then he told her, "Malik Johnson." The officer took a step closer, still eyeing him suspiciously. "You don't look like you belong around here," she said, her words heavy with an accusation that didn't make sense. Malik felt his face flush, but he kept his voice steady. "I live here," he said, pointing to the row of houses nearby. The officers exchanged a look, but neither of them stepped back. Instead, the man officer reached for his radio. "We'll just run your ID," he said, his tone not leaving room for any disagreement. "Wait right here." Malik's mind raced. He didn't have anything to hide, but he knew that being black meant he could be treated differently. His frustration grew, but he stayed quiet. The more the officer spoke to him, the more it became clear they weren't interested in listening to his side of the story. They had already made up their minds about who he was. As Malik stood there, he made a decision. He knew he needed to call his father. His dad, Chief Johnson, was in charge of the entire police department. If anyone could help clear this up, it was him. But as Malik took out his phone, the situation only seemed to get worse. Malik's fingers trembled slightly as he dialed his father's number. He knew that calling his dad might help, but at the same time, he felt a sense of unease. The situation was escalating quickly, and he wasn't sure if it would make things better or worse. But as the phone rang in his ear, Malik tried to stay calm, focusing on the sound of his father's voice that would soon be on the other end. The officers stood nearby, their eyes still fixed on him. They had stopped asking questions for now, but Malik could feel their judgment weighing on him. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he knew his rights, and he wasn't about to back down. He had nothing to hide. "Hello." His father's voice broke through the tension, and Malik quickly spoke. "Dad," Malik said, his voice steady but firm. "I need you here, right now." His father's tone immediately shifted to concern. "What's going on, son? Are you okay?" Malik glanced at the officers again, noticing how they stood in front of him like a wall, not even bothering to be polite. "These two officers stopped me for no reason," Malik said. "They're treating me like I'm doing something wrong, but I'm just walking home from school." Malik could hear his father's breath on the other end, a deep sigh of frustration. "Stay where you are, Malik. I'll be there in a few minutes. Don't say anything else, okay?" Malik nodded, though he knew his father couldn't see him. He could hear the rustling sound of his father preparing to leave the office. Malik stayed still, watching the two officers as they exchanged looks. He felt a mix of anger and disappointment. Why was he being treated like this? The officer who had first spoken to Malik, Officer Davis, stepped forward again, his voice sharp. "You've been standing here long enough. We're going to need to search you. You have anything on you that you shouldn't." Malik's heart sank. This was getting worse. He had already answered their questions, but now they were demanding more. "I haven't done anything wrong," Malik said firmly, but the officer didn't seem to care. "Hand over your bag," Officer Davis ordered. Malik took a deep breath, then slowly handed over his backpack. He didn't feel scared, just frustrated. He knew this wasn't right. As the officer began to dig through his things, Malik could see the disapproving look on Officer Green's face. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him made it clear that she had already decided what kind of person he was. Just then, Malik's phone buzzed in his hand. His father had texted him, confirming he was on his way. Malik was relieved, knowing his dad would take care of things. But even with his father coming, Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. How many other young people, especially those like him, were treated this way? Malik tried not to let his frustration show, but as the officers continued their search, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. This wasn't just one bad encounter. It was a part of a larger problem. And as the officers finished searching his bag, Malik's patience was wearing thin. He knew that with his father's arrival, the truth would come to light, but the damage of this moment would stay with him. Malik's heart raced as he stood there, feeling the weight of the officers' judgment on him. He had done nothing wrong, yet they had stopped him without reason, searched his belongings, and treated him like a criminal. The unfairness of it all burned in his chest, but he knew that showing anger wouldn't solve anything. He needed to remain calm, especially now that he had called his father. The officers stood nearby, not speaking, their eyes lingering on Malik. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. Malik's mind was racing, but he tried to focus on the moment at hand. He had done the right thing by calling his father, the chief of police. Malik's dad was a well-respected figure, and he would know how to handle the situation. "Malik," Officer Davis said, breaking the silence. "You can go now. We'll let you off with a warning. Just make sure you stay out of trouble." Malik's eyes narrowed. "A warning?" he repeated, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "You shouldn't have stopped me in the first place. I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Green, still quiet, shifted her stance, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Malik could tell that she knew they had made a mistake, but she was reluctant to admit it. Officer Davis, on the other hand, still seemed defensive. "We were just doing our job," he muttered. "I'm not asking you to do your job," Malik replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking you to treat me like a person, not just a suspect. You've made me feel like I don't belong here, and that's not right." Just as Malik finished speaking, his phone buzzed. He quickly glanced at it and saw a message from his dad. "I'm on my way. Stay calm." Malik felt a sense of relief wash over him. His dad was coming, and he knew that everything would be sorted out once he arrived. But in that moment, Malik also realized something important. He was just one person, and his experience was just one example of how people of color were often treated unfairly by the police. It wasn't just about this stop. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change. The officers seemed to sense Malik's growing confidence, and their posture shifted. Officer Davis looked around, trying to avoid eye contact. Malik could see that they were starting to feel uneasy, realizing they had made a serious mistake. He wasn't just some random person on the street. They had no right to treat him this way. As Malik waited, he could hear the sound of another car pulling up. He looked over and saw his father's familiar vehicle. Malik's dad, Chief Johnson, stepped out of the car with a calm, collected expression. The moment the officers saw him, their faces shifted from indifference to concern. They immediately straightened up, their posture changing as they recognized the man who was now walking toward them. "Is there a problem here?" Chief Johnson's voice was calm, but carried an authority that immediately made the officers uneasy. Malik's dad was a respected figure in the department, and he didn't tolerate any form of misconduct. Officer Davis cleared his throat and stepped forward, but his nervousness was apparent. "We were just conducting a stop," he said, his voice unsteady. "Your son was walking down the street, and we had reason to question him." Chief Johnson's eyes locked on Officer Davis. "What reason?" he asked, his tone serious. "Do you have any evidence that my son was doing anything illegal?" The officers remained silent, realizing they had no justification for their actions. The weight of the situation hung in the air, and both officers understood that they had crossed a line. The silence that followed Chief Johnson's question was thick with tension. Officer Davis stood there, his face flushed, unable to answer. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner, Officer Green, who also remained silent, clearly uneasy with the situation. It was clear to both officers that they had made a serious mistake, but neither of them knew how to fix it. Malik stood next to his father, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. He had known calling his father was the right thing to do. Malik's dad had always been a strong role model for him, someone who believed in justice and fairness. Now, seeing his father stand up for him, Malik felt a sense of reassurance that the situation would be handled properly. Chief Johnson took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes fixed on Officer Davis. "I expect an explanation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You had no reason to stop my son, and you certainly had no reason to search him. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" Officer Davis opened his mouth to respond, but words didn't come easily. He glanced down at the ground, clearly ashamed of his actions. Officer Green, standing beside him, seemed equally uncomfortable, her hands still crossed in front of her as she avoided making eye contact. I'm sorry, Chief," Officer Davis finally stammered. "We didn't mean to cause trouble. It's just that we saw him walking, and that's enough," Chief Johnson interrupted, his voice firm. "You don't stop someone for walking down the street. You don't judge someone based on how they look. You're trained to know better than that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was only the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Malik could see the officers' guilt written on their faces, but it was too late for excuses. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. Chief Johnson turned to Malik, his expression softening. "Son, are you okay?" he asked, his voice now full of concern. Malik nodded, though the frustration and anger from the encounter still lingered inside him. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." Chief Johnson gave a small nod and then turned back to the officers. "I'm going to make sure this is reported," he said, his voice resolute. "This behavior is unacceptable, and it will be addressed." Officer Green spoke up for the first time, her voice quieter than before. "We didn't mean to make it worse. We're sorry," she said, looking at Malik. "We should have handled it differently." Malik didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to feel. Yes, they were apologizing, but the damage was already done. The way they had treated him, questioning him without cause, searching his belongings without permission, left him feeling small and humiliated. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been treated like a criminal simply because of how he looked. Chief Johnson, sensing the weight of the moment, placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Let's go home, son," he said, his voice comforting. Malik followed his father to the car, still feeling the sting of the unfair treatment, but grateful for the support. He knew his father would take care of things, but it didn't take away the pain of the experience. As they got into the car, Malik looked out the window, deep in thought. This incident wasn't just about what happened to him. It was a reminder of the larger issue that still existed in their society. But Malik was determined. He knew that with his father's help, they could bring about change, and no one else would have to face what he had just gone through. The drive home was quiet, But Malik's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The unfairness of it all, the way he had been treated like a criminal for simply walking home, weighed heavily on him. It was as if his presence alone had made him a target. Chief Johnson, noticing his son's silence, glanced at him from time to time but said nothing. He knew Malik needed space to process the experience. They both knew that situations like this were far too common, but it was still hard to accept when it happened to someone you loved. When they arrived home, Malik sat on the couch, deep in thought. Chief Johnson took a seat beside him, resting his hand on Malik's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said quietly. "You handled yourself well out there." Malik looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "I don't understand, Dad. Why did they treat me like that? Just because I'm black?" Chief Johnson sighed. "Unfortunately, yes. People are judged by the color of their skin all the time. And while I spent my career trying to make sure the police force acts justly, we still have a long way to go. But today, you taught me something important. You showed that when someone stands up for themselves, change can happen." Malik felt a small sense of relief hearing his father's words. But he still couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. "It just feels wrong, Dad. I was just walking home. Why is that something to be afraid of?" His father looked thoughtful. "It's not about you, Malik. It's about the way some people view others because of their race. And that's something that needs to change. You, me, everyone. We have to keep fighting for fairness." The words of his father made Malik think more deeply. The experience had left him feeling small, but his father's perspective reminded him of the bigger picture. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was part of something larger, something that required effort from everyone. That night, after dinner, Chief Johnson sat down at his desk and began writing up a report on what had happened to Malik. He included every detail: the wrongful stop, the search, the inappropriate comments made by the officers. He wanted to make sure this was not brushed aside, that it was dealt with properly. Malik watched as his father worked. He could see the determination in his dad's eyes, the commitment to justice that had guided his career. He knew that his father would hold the officers accountable, but Malik also realized that the fight for justice didn't stop with one incident. It had to be a continuous effort. The next day, Chief Johnson made sure the incident was officially reported to the higher-ups in the department. He made it clear that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The officers involved would face an internal review, and Malik's experience would be part of the department's training on racial bias. When Malik returned to school the following week, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced something difficult, but he knew that this experience had given him a platform to speak out about the injustices many people faced every day. He wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was someone who could bring about change, someone who had a voice that mattered. Days passed, and things at home slowly returned to normal. But Malik couldn't stop thinking about what happened. He had been treated unfairly by the officers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his experience was just one of many. He started hearing stories from friends and classmates, people who had gone through similar situations. He realized that it wasn't just one bad experience. It was part of a bigger problem that affected many people in their community. Malik's father, Chief Johnson, was still working on the case. He had kept his promise to Malik, making sure the incident was being taken seriously. Officer Davis and Officer Green had been called in for an internal review. Malik's dad wasn't going to let this slide. He knew that the behavior of the officers needed to be addressed, not just for Malik's sake, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. One afternoon, Malik received a call from his father while he was at school. Chief Johnson's voice was serious but comforting. "I just wanted to update you," he said. "The officers involved have been placed on probation, and they're going through additional training. We're also going to implement some changes in the department. There will be a greater focus on community relations and more training on racial bias." Malik listened carefully. "I'm glad to hear that, Dad," he replied. "But I still feel like we need to do more." This shouldn't just be about those two officers. It's about changing the whole system, right? You're right, Chief Johnson agreed. It's not just about punishing the officers. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. We need to change the way people are treated, and that starts with everyone, officers, leaders, and the community. Malik felt a sense of hope after hearing his father's words. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least things were moving in the right direction. He knew that change would take time, but he also knew that his voice, along with his father's leadership, could make a real difference. A few days later, the police department held a community meeting. Malik's father spoke first, addressing the room filled with residents. He explained what had happened, how the department was responding, and what steps would be taken to ensure it didn't happen again. He also invited members of the community to share their thoughts and concerns. Malik was nervous as he stood up to speak. It wasn't easy to talk about something so personal, but he knew it was important. He took a deep breath and began. I've been stopped by the police before, and every time, I felt like I was being judged, not for anything I did, but just for who I am. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who look like me. His words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. Malik could see people nodding in agreement, their faces showing a mix of understanding and determination. He felt proud, knowing that by sharing his experience, he was helping to start a conversation that could bring about real change. That evening, Malik went home feeling different. He knew there was still work to do, but he felt hopeful. He wasn't just a young man facing injustice. He was part of a movement to create a more just and equal world. And with his father's support, he was confident that their community could become a better place for everyone. The weeks following the community meeting were filled with progress. The department began to implement the changes that Chief Johnson had promised, and the town started to see a shift in the way people were treated by the police. Training on racial bias became a regular part of the officers' schedule, and community outreach programs were established to build trust between the police and the people they served. Malik continued to feel proud of the changes that were taking place, but he knew it wasn't enough to simply make a few adjustments. He had learned that real change required constant effort. He started working alongside his father, attending meetings, and helping organize more community events. He wanted to ensure that everyone, no matter their background, felt safe and respected in their own neighborhood. One afternoon, Chief Johnson called Malik into his office. Malik was surprised but walked in, eager to hear what his father had to say. As soon as he entered, he noticed that his father's desk was piled with papers and reports. It had been a busy few weeks, and Malik could see the weight of it all on his father's face. "Dad, what's going on?" Malik asked, sitting across from him. Chief Johnson looked up from his papers and smiled. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. We've been getting a lot of support from the community, but there's still work to be done. The changes we've started are just the beginning. I need your help with something." Malik raised an eyebrow. "What do you need help with?" "I've been asked to speak at a state conference about police reform," Chief Johnson said. "They want to hear from someone who's been on the front lines of these changes. I can't think of anyone better than you to join me and talk about your experience and the changes we've made." Malik's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? You want me to speak at the conference?" His father nodded. "Yes, your voice matters, Malik. You've shown that even a young person can make a difference. You've lived through this, and you know what needs to change. I want you to be part of that conversation." Malik felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had never spoken at a conference before, but the idea of sharing his story and helping others understand the importance of change filled him with a sense of purpose. "I'd be honored, Dad." The conference took place a few weeks later, and Malik found himself standing on a stage in front of a large audience. His heart was racing, but as he looked out at the crowd, he felt a sense of confidence. His father stood beside him, offering silent encouragement. "Good afternoon," Malik began, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. I'm Malik Johnson, and I want to share my story with you today. It's a story about unfair treatment, about being judged because of the color of my skin, and about how one experience changed the way I saw the world. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. I was stopped by the police for no reason other than the way I look, but instead of letting that break me, I chose to speak out. And I'm standing here today because I believe that things can change. But change doesn't happen on its own. It takes all of us, police, lawmakers, and the community, to make sure everyone is treated with respect. Malik looked over at his father, who smiled back at him with pride. This isn't just about one person or one family. It's about creating a system where everyone feels safe and valued. I'm proud of the changes we've made in our town, but I know we can do more. As Malik finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just for his words. It was for the message they carried. That change was possible, and it started with people willing to stand up and speak out. That night, as Malik and his father walked back to their hotel, Malik felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had started with a simple goal, to make sure no one else had to go through what he had experienced. Now, he knew that his efforts had made a difference, and that difference would continue to grow.